With all the craziness going on, it's time for you to start growing some of your own food. Today, Zach Buchel talks to us about some important tips that will help you grow a successful survival garden the first year.
Hey, Provident Preppers, I'm Kylene.
And I'm Jonathan, and today we are excited to be with Zach Buchel. He's from Farm Table West, and we found him on YouTube, and he is doing some great things. Zach, tell us a little bit about who you are and your good work.
Hi, everybody. I am Zach Buchel. I own Farm Table West, which is a 1/3 acre vegetable farm in Cody, Wyoming. And this year, 2024, we were able to sell $86,000 worth of food on 1/3 of an acre in a 120-day growing season. So we do a lot of really intensive production on small acreage in a very cold climate.
That is totally amazing. That is awesome.
Our world is getting crazier and crazier. And as many of you seasoned gardeners know, it's really difficult to just get started on a garden and have high production. It takes time. But right now, we might not have the luxury of time anymore, and spring is quickly coming. So that's why we invited Zach on to help a lot of us gain more knowledge, but especially for those beginner gardeners to know how they can very quickly and inexpensively have a harvest as soon as maybe 6 weeks. So Zach, tell us all your secrets.
If I was brand new and had never grown food before, what I would do is set up a no-dig garden. The reason for that is no-dig basically means you're putting cardboard down on the footprint of the space you're going to grow your food first. So you could do this straight on your lawn, and you just need to decide where you want to permanently grow your food in your backyard. And then you layer 6 inches of compost in the place you actually want to grow your food, so your beds, your growing space, and then 6 inches of wood chips on the pathways and the perimeters. What this does is you could plant straight into that compost the first year, and then every year after that, the compost will become more and more productive. And all you have to do is add 1 inch of compost and wood chips to each space. So it's really easy once you set it up the first time, and your weed pressure will be almost nothing. I do a no-dig garden for my family, and then I do a different style of growing for my farm. And it's way lower maintenance to do the no-dig style. You can pretty much just set it up, forget about it, and 3 months later you'll have food if you really wanted to do that. So it's really easy. All you need to do is make sure you get the right kind of compost and wood chips relatively cheaply. And I have a whole PDF guide at the link in the description that is called my Backyard Farm Launchpad that can walk you through the entire process. So you can print it off, and it'll show you where to buy compost and wood chips if you don't have a good source of compost in your area, because compost can be kind of difficult to get in big quantities, but there's a couple of brands at Home Depot you can buy, and it will get the job done. What this will do is it will make it much easier for you to increase your growing space as opposed to buying or building raised beds, because when you invest all your resources in just increasing your growing space, you increase the amount of food you can grow. And this is basically the style of farming that I do to get the kind of yields that we get in our short growing season. We just maximize the amount of growing space we can plant throughout the year. This allows you to do that. You don't have to till any ground. You don't have to worry about soil tests your first year. All you need to do is get really high quality compost. And that pretty much does the soil fertility work for you your first year, and it just gets better over time. So it's sort of like mimicking forest floor. So you know how in a forest there's trees, and the trees drop their leaves every year, and that builds soil. And you notice like the soil underneath the tree is really black. It's because the trees are dropping their leaves, and that adds fertility to the soil. And a lot of times that soil underneath the tree is very fertile. And this is the same concept. So what it does is it creates highways for all the microorganisms in the soil, so the microorganisms can feed the plant really, really good year after year. And when you till, that microorganism highway is disturbed and you don't have the nutrient access that you do when you don't till. It's a really cool way to do it. And in my experience, it is the easiest way to grow year one, because the way we do things on the farm, it takes a couple years to really get high production. But this, your first year, you can grow truckloads of food in a really small space.
So I have a couple questions for you. The first one is the cardboard. Do I need to worry about what type of cardboard or anything, or can I just lay it down?
What you want to do, there's a couple different ways to do this, and I go a lot more in detail in the Backyard Farm Launchpad, but you can actually buy this stuff called builder's paper at Home Depot. That's really cheap. You could get a 400-foot roll for like $15, and that would work great. It's just this brown cardboard paper that you could lay on the entire footprint. Or you could go to your local recycling center and get a truckload of old boxes and rip the tape off. That's free. It takes a lot more time. It's a lot harder to do, in my experience. If I was you, I would just buy the stuff at Home Depot, because you don't have to rip the tape off. Because you don't want, the tape is going to stay in the ground and kind of get gross over time. It won't really work that well. But you could have ink on the cardboard, but you don't want colored ink. Colored ink is going to mess up your soil, but most of that stuff's going to break down 5-10 years down the line anyway. So it doesn't matter a whole lot. It just needs to block light. That's the whole point of this. It's blocking light so the existing plants don't grow through the space you want to grow your food.
And then I am putting wood chips in the path and compost where I want to plant. Right? Okay.
Right.
That's exciting. I can do that. That's easy.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's really easy. Once you do that, what I would recommend focusing on your first year is growing these 10 crops. These 10 crops are the backbone of my business and how my business makes money. And they can provide you a lot of value if you're a beginner and you live in a really short season. So what I recommend people focus on: carrots, turnips, radishes, spinach, beets, zucchini, cucumber, kale, bunching onions, and parsley. If you know anything about plants, 8 of those crops are frost tolerant. So they can all survive through a frost. And 2 of them are not. More than half of those crops, you could produce 2 crops a year, even in a 120-day growing season like me. That's a really easy way to double the amount of food you can grow in the same growing space, because growing space is where you're going to spend most of your money to set up your garden. So growing 2 crops a year increases your yield. And then the other half, you plant once and then you harvest multiple times. And this whole concept is how my farm is able to make money as a business. And I have some recommendations on how much seed to buy. I talk a lot about True Leaf Market to buy seeds, because you can buy bulk seeds there pretty easily, and all of their seeds are open pollinated, which, if you are experienced in seed saving, you need to have open pollinated or heirloom seeds to save seed. I'm actually not. I don't usually do that. I just buy fresh seed every year because it's easier. Like on my farm, I just don't have time to be saving seed. To be honest, in my experience, it doesn't matter a whole lot where you buy the seeds. It's more about knowing how to grow. That's much more important, because the seeds are a very small part of the expense. I just looked at Epic Gardening seeds the other day, and they're a little more expensive, but if you buy 3 or 4 seed packets of their seed size, you get the same amount of seed for a few more dollars. You know, where seeds are way cheaper than food. If you buy food at the store, that's a lot more expensive than buying seeds. So that's something to keep in mind. The reason I use those crops as the backbone of my business is because we have 120 frost-free days. So we have to be able to harvest food after a frost. Our first frost usually comes around September 21st. We're still harvesting food right now, and it's December 28th today. So we're harvesting 12 months a year on my farm, and we don't have fancy heated greenhouses. We just have unheated greenhouses. So the concept for us harvesting in the winter is the same concept you could use to harvest in November in your climate, most likely. If you have 2 feet of snow, it's going to be tricky. So carrots, parsley, kale, spinach, those can all take really deep cold. You could harvest those below 25 degrees Fahrenheit. So that stretches your harvest window quite a bit. And you could also harvest a lot of those twice throughout the year. And all of the root vegetables can be stored for 3 to 6 months in a proper storage environment, which is actually a lot easier to get than you think. You could get a refrigerator on a classifieds page, or you could just buy one new, but you could get an old refrigerator that's just a stand-up one for like $100 a lot of times on a Facebook classifieds page. And you could store all of your root vegetables through the winter in that fridge. And that's your root cellar. And it doesn't cost much at all to run that for electricity. Like our walk-in cooler on my farm costs maybe $50 a month in the summertime to run, and probably like $10 a month to run in the winter because it's cold already. So that walk-in cooler keeps your vegetables at a 38, 39 degree temperature, which is what you want in a root cellar. But it's a lot easier than digging a 10-foot deep pit and concreting walls and all that stuff. So it's like a modern day root cellar. So you could store half of the crops I'm talking about in a fridge for a long time and really stretch your eating window of the crops. And then stuff like kale, spinach, parsley, you could be harvesting it in November after a really deep cold, and it just tastes really sweet and delicious. All you got to do is wait for it to thaw in the daytime, and you've got fresh kale, parsley, spinach, all that kind of stuff. So those crops are the backbone of my business in a really short climate, and I think they would work great in a really small, cold climate backyard garden. So
it sounds like these are seeds that you would have great success with. And I think that's part of what we see is people try something and maybe they're not trying something that's easy to grow. They fail and they say, never mind, I'll just go to the store, which is okay right now because it's, that's available, but it may not always be. What are your suggestions?
And that's a huge reason why I chose these seeds, because they're easy. Stuff like tomatoes is, in my experience, tomatoes are really difficult to put food on the table right away. Like it's taken me 3-4 years to get good at growing a large amount of tomatoes. Everybody wants to grow tomatoes when they start a garden because they're fun. Everybody loves tomatoes. It's sort of the centerpiece of gardening and growing food in general. There's so many things that could go wrong with growing tomatoes. There's blight, there's frost damage, there's stunting. They're very picky. And stuff like zucchini, in my experience, you put a seed in the ground, you're guaranteed to get a crop 50 to 60 days later. You put a seed in the ground. You don't even have to start it in your nursery. So these are all crops you could literally put seeds directly in the ground. You don't even need to have a nursery inside or grow in your living room or anything like that. I think there's a lot of romance around the tomatoes and a lot of crops that are not going to easily put food on the table. And actually carrots are pretty tricky too, but they're so valuable. Once you get those right, you could grow a lot of other stuff easily because they're difficult to germinate. But carrots, in terms of like yield per square foot, are one of the highest value crops on this list. That's why I put them first, because you could not only grow 2 crops a year, but you could store them for 6 months in that fridge.
So I have to tell a little secret about what we do.
Oh,
So
cool.
with our beets and carrots, our neighbors give us bags of leaves, and we just put the bags of leaves in the black bag right on top of them. And then we harvest them all winter long. And it's because even in the snow, we just pull up the bag, and the carrots are so sweet. If you're harvesting your carrots in like February and March, they're amazing. So just that, that means we didn't dig them in advance. We bottle carrots sometimes, but for the most part, we just leave them in the ground and pull them up as we want to eat them.
That's like half the reason to grow carrots right there. That's what I'm obsessed with that. We are harvesting about 200 pounds of carrots a week right now because we call them candy carrots. We sell them as candy carrots. They're worth more, and they taste like there's sugar injected into them because they've been frosted. Yeah. Oh, they're so good. That little trick alone, I don't think that many people do it, because you have to know how to grow fall carrots, and that's not really as easy as it sounds. But man, once you can master that, is just like this whole cornucopia of food. And that's another way to store them too, right? You don't have to actually harvest them in September. You can harvest them in November. You store them an extra 3 months in the ground. Storing them in the ground is the easiest way. Just for perspective, I said we sold $86,000 in food this year. 15,000 of it was carrots. So that's how big of a deal carrots are for my business. Like, because of all the trick you just mentioned, I would say probably half of that is going to be this through the winter. So we sell a lot more carrots through the winter than we do in the summer because of that. So the next trick to making all of that happen in your climate is basically going to be timing. If you can master plant timing on those 10 crops, you're going to have really good chance of success. You just have to start each one of those crops in the right time window before or after your average last frost in the spring. And so for us in Wyoming, our average last frost is May 21st. So my entire planting schedule is based on that date. There's a bunch of resources online to get that information, and I go into it a lot more detail on my YouTube channel, but if you get that timing right, you're going to increase your chances of success a lot. And one example I always talk about with this concept is growing tomatoes. Everybody wants to grow tomatoes in their garden, and if you're new to gardening, you're going to want to start those tomatoes as soon as possible. You probably saw a seed calendar in January, you bought your tomato seeds, and in February you want to start them. So in my climate, if you wanted to start tomatoes in February and plant them outside, what's going to happen is that you start that tomato in February, you might have it ready. It'll outgrow that pot in your living room in March. If I planted that tomato in March, most likely it's going to die from frost. If it doesn't, what will happen is it'll sit in the ground from March till about first week in June and not change if you're lucky. And then it will grow, but it'll be so stunted that the plant will produce maybe half of what it would have if you planted it at the right time. So for me, the right time is in April to start a tomato seed. Patience is a big part of the success here. You got to wait for the right time, because all plants will produce more food if they grow uninterrupted from seed to harvest. So the more interruptions, like cold temperatures or bad weather events, pests getting to them, the chances of all those things increase when you plant your stuff too early. And then in the spring, planting too late is a little bit less of an issue for the most part, because you've got the rest of your growing season for that crop to produce. But it does matter a lot for fall timing though. And when I first started, I was exactly like the person I described a minute ago. I was super excited. I started everything way too early, and because I'm always trying to push the envelope in my growing season. But in my experience, about half the time it just flat out didn't work for one reason or another, because the climate just wasn't ready. So it's really important to work with your growing season and your climate instead of against it. And that's just going to increase your chance of success.
And I think one of the things that's important here is this is a learning process. Even experienced gardeners are still learning things. And I think that's something that people need to understand, is it's going to be a learning thing. So if you fail on something, don't throw your hands up. Say, okay, what can I learn? And talk to other gardeners, figure out what went wrong, fix it. And in some cases, you just decide, okay, that's not a crop that I want to deal with. Like you with, you're talking about tomatoes. Maybe that's not a good one for people to start with, but learn from it and grow literally. And that's the way this all works.
Oh, absolutely. Failure is growth. That's the way I look at failure. Like, failure is you taking one step closer to where you want to be. You are getting better. And I don't always see it that way in the moment, for sure. I definitely curse and I get mad and frustrated and want to pull my hair out, but it's so valuable. Failure is really underrated in today's day and age. I'm only 4 years into this. I had almost zero farming experience 4 years ago. So I'm still very much in the journey of learning. I have so much more to grow as a grower. I'm always going to be a student myself. So I think that's a really good way to look at it, is always learn. Embrace the failure, as difficult as that can be in the moment, for sure. The most important step to increasing your food yields is planting a fall crop. If you plant all 10 of those crops as you are harvesting those crops throughout the summer, so for example, you plant your radishes in May and they're ready in June. As you harvest that space that you planted the radishes, if you replant it to another crop, say like beets or bunching onions in the same space, you will get 2 crops in that same space. Most people just stop planting their garden around Memorial Day. They plant it all out and they're all excited. And then by July, they're exhausted because the weeds have just taken over and it's just a disaster. But if you stay disciplined and replant every time you harvest a crop and replant to something else, you double the amount of food. Big reason why no dig is so valuable is it's really easy to do that. You don't have to do any fancy bed prep. Your compost is already there. All you got to do is replant it, and you should have enough compost to feed that second crop. And when you get more advanced, you could do things to increase the fertility of your soil every time. But for a beginner, that's a really easy thing to do. And the way to be successful with fall gardening is the same thing as spring gardening. You need to stay on time. And it's a little trickier with fall, but we have a fall planting calendar in the description for people. And that's exactly the calendar I use to grow all of our fall crops on the farm. And it's just as simple as checking that calendar every single week, starting from like July or even mid-June through September, and check it every single week. Is there something I could plant this week? And it takes like 5 minutes. This isn't a lot of time. You just check that list every single week. And if you have time to plant the crop that you want to grow, throw it in that spot that you just harvested the radishes, and you double the amount of food. Especially if you focus on the crops I'm talking about here. If you planted a fall crop of spinach, you could plant a whole 10-foot by 3-foot space of spinach and not even harvest it until October, and just leave it in the ground and harvest it little bits from October through November. So you could plant a huge space of really cold hardy crops and harvest it deep into the fall. And that also stretches your harvest window. When you're growing food, all you really care about is the harvest window. It's not really your growing season, it's the harvest window. So
Yeah, and especially in a crisis situation, you're going to really want to optimize. And this was wonderful. And Kylene taught me to this just a few years ago, because I always figured, yeah, you just plant it, and then when it's done, you just kind of give thanks for what you had and leave it till the next year. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Oh no, we never leave the garden. We're a little bit milder than you are, right? Our climate. So if I leave my fall spinach in the ground early in the spring, I'll end up having another harvest all over my spinach and my kale and my chard. But then it will rapidly go to seed. So I only get that one harvest, but that allows me time to plant my new ones. And by the time those have gone to seed, I've got more ready to eat.
yeah, that right there is another huge benefit to this too. I forgot about that. And so when you say you harvest in the spring, are you talking like March or something around that time?
It all depends on the weather. It depends on the kind of spring, because that spinach, all of a sudden, it'll just say, ooh, I want to be happy, right?
Yeah. But even that's a huge harvest right there. I mean, usually that's going to come between like March and May. Who's harvesting from their garden in March and May? Nobody. Yeah. One of my heroes is a guy named Charles Dowding on YouTube. And if you want to learn more about no dig, that guy's YouTube channel, he's the guy, I believe, who invented no dig gardening. I could be wrong on that, but he's in England. Master gardener. I'm a huge fan of him. He talks about that particular time as the hungry gap, where nothing is really coming out of the garden. So It's like March, April, May. And so if you have something that survived all winter and regrows during that time, huge amount of food at a time where almost nobody's harvesting anything. That's a huge part of our business too. We have all these winter greens in the greenhouse, like spinach, Tokyo bacana, arugula, and it's all kind of dormant right now. But once we hit early February, it's all going to start regrowing, and we have a huge truckload of salad greens between February and May. No farm has food coming off their farm at February through May, pretty much. So this is one of the reasons why I love growing in a cold climate now that I've been doing it for so long, is because I look forward to the frost. All of that spinach, kale, carrots, all of that stuff gets sweeter as it gets colder, and you cannot buy that at the store. And I genuinely, I could taste the difference when I'm making a stir fry with this stuff. There's sugar in that food that you cannot get at the store. And I think the more people experience that part of it, the more fun it's going to be to keep doing every year, you know? And And actually, that brings me to my last point, basically, is that if you grow those 10 crops, you can leave carrots, kale, spinach, radishes, beets, green onions, parsley in the ground down to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm just saying that You could actually leave some of them in the ground for even colder than that, but 25 degrees, almost all of those crops will survive that. So if you live in a climate where it doesn't get below 25 degrees until mid to late November, you can leave all that food in the ground an extra, 5-6 weeks past your first frost date. So you basically just increased your harvest window 4 or 5 weeks, depending on your climate. So I think there's this perception with a lot of gardeners that harvest everything in September, can it all, freeze it all, do whatever you need to do, and have this, spend a whole weekend preserving what's in your garden. And that's a lot of work. Like, I don't have time to can on my farm. Like, there's no way we could can and preserve food like that. We have to just work with what's in the ground, basically, and work with how the plant performs. We just harvest in succession. So we plan the whole garden or farm to be harvested slowly but surely throughout our entire winter. But even outside, you could do it through November, basically. If you plant a big amount of a lot of these crops in the middle of the summer, whenever you have a big opening in your garden, you plant it all out with carrots. Carrots are the biggest one. You can harvest like 5 pounds of carrots a week, October through November, or whatever you want to do. You have the option now, basically. It really lowers the amount of stress that you might have in September to like rush and harvest everything at once. If you stretch those harvests deep into your fall or winter, it makes it a lot easier on you.
Absolutely. That's spreading that out and keeping that in the ground and actually getting better nutrients.
Yeah, and it increases the quality, in my opinion, too. This is how I'm building my farm to be able to actually keep employees through the winter. This whole concept is what is going to keep employees for us through the winter, hopefully starting next year, because we'll have little bits of harvest every week during the winter that keeps our business running. But the same thing that keeps our business running is the same thing that can provide you food, little bits throughout your fall and winter. It's just stretching the harvest as far past your first frost as humanly possible. And it makes life a lot easier. And it also makes it so we don't have to stress about making all of our money in August and September like a lot of farms do. So I can actually take time off during that time. You could do the same thing in your garden. You don't have to stress so much during the summer to get everything harvested and put away. You could just relax a little bit. If it's August and you have 20 kale plants in your garden, which sounds like a lot, but if you know what I'm talking about, as the days get shorter, that kale will just sit there and you don't have to worry about it going bad because it's going to survive really deep frosts. And you could just harvest it a little bit at a time throughout October, November, maybe even December. It takes a lot of the stress off you mentally if you just plan it out that way and harvest a little bit at a time. And it makes it easier on your back too. Doing a lot of work at once is really hard on your back. I definitely have experience with that.
Thank you so much, Zach. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience before we close?
Thank you for having me. And yeah, if you're interested in a little more in-depth explanation on some of the stuff I'm talking about, I have a lot of YouTube videos on everything I talked about today. And I have a free online community that I'm starting to, it's on the platform called School, where we're connecting growers from all over the world and people are sharing their experience. And it's already really cool. We have people from New Zealand and Philippines and stuff like that. So we have that. And I also have a gardening course that I explain everything you need to know from seed to harvest on growing a garden like this in your backyard too.
I can tell you that the gold is in the communities, right?
Yes.
It's amazing what we learn from each other. That is fantastic. We encourage you guys to go out to Farm Table West and subscribe and learn because times are really challenging right now. And there's no better time to start than right now. We've got this season right in front of us. And you might not be able to do it on a large scale right now, but what can you do on a small scale? Anything from just herbs in your kitchen window to veggies in a pot or to starting your own no-dig garden. We just strongly encourage you to grow some of your own food and to find that joy that we find in not only growing it, but in eating it. Because like Zach was talking about, there's nothing better than candy carrots.
Amen.
And now for our audience, the question of the day: what questions do you still have for Zach about growing a thriving survival garden? Comment below And thanks for being part of the solution.